Amsterdam, early September 1796. Moses Salomon Asser, a Jewish man, 42 years of age, has just started his day. He is holding a letter in his hand. His gaze passes through the window and hovers over the rippling waters of the Singel, one of Amsterdam's famous canals. His face seems agitated and his hands are slightly trembling. Then, suddenly, he turns to the door, grabs his mantle and leaves the house. After a short brisk walk, Mr. Asser enters the building of the Jewish Felix Libertate Society. It seems that most of the members whom he summoned earlier have already arrived. More than 50 men are looking at him impatiently. "I just received this letter from my son Carol," Mr. Asser announces with a somewhat shivering voice. He attended the audience of the National Assembly in The Hague the other day. They finally released a decree which grants equal rights to us Jews. In fact, on September 2nd, 1796, Dutch Jews were granted equal rights and citizenship. Earlier, on July 19, 1795, Holland, which then was the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, had been invaded by the French Revolutionary Army. The Dutch pro-French Patriot Party proclaimed the Batavian Republic. To celebrate, people danced around the Liberty Tree, placed at the center of Amsterdam's Dam Square, renamed Revolution Square. On the Hogesluis Bridge over the Amstel River, 3 pillars were set up. The symbolic motifs they carried refer to the 3 primary revolutionary ideals: freedom, equality, and brotherhood. Lit by oil lamps at nighttime, they would have illuminated the essence of the Enlightenment, the dominating philosophical movement of 18th century Europe, which had incited the revolutionary spirit. Yet, the strong wind blew out the lamps. It was the wind of change. The French Revolution had started 6 years earlier, in 1789. It was a period of momentous social and political transformation. Bad harvests had led to food shortages. The French king's financial support of the North American struggle for independence from Great Britain had increased the national debt. France was in a deep financial crisis. Discontent among the members of France's middle and lower classes resulted in strengthened organized opposition to the corrupt and oppressive ancient regime. Revolutionary forces overthrew the monarchy. King Louis XVI of France was guillotined on January 21, 1793. A republic was established. Thereafter, revolutionary France waged wars against other aristocratic and monarchist regimes in Europe. Large territories in Western Europe came under French control. The Batavian Republic, established in what is today the Netherlands, was a client state of France. On March 1, 1796, the Batavian National Assembly gathered for the first time in The Hague. This was the first elected parliament in Dutch history. It adopted the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, the fundamental text of the revolution, and forbade the distinction between citizens based on religious identity. Religious groups that had been excluded from public office were granted equal rights now: the Catholics, the Freemasons, except for the Jews. Mr. Asser and his Jewish companions founded in 1795, soon after the French invasion of the Netherlands, the Felix Libertate Society. They gathered and instructed themselves and one another in politics, philosophy, sciences, arts, and history. They aimed to broaden their horizons in order to be accepted as self-conscious, responsible, politically active, and free Batavian Dutch citizens. Hence the name Felix Libertate, which in Latin means happy due to freedom. Mr. Astor had traveled along with a fellow Felix Libertate member to The Hague. They had personally handed over the request of equality for Jews to Mr. Kastele, the president of the Batavian National Assembly. Eventually, also with pressure from French representatives, on September 2nd, 1796, with a large majority of votes, the decree was validated. This was a remarkable achievement. Since the early 1600s, Jews had resided in the Netherlands. By the end of the 1700s, Amsterdam counted 21,500 Jews, approximately 10% of the city's total population. It was the largest Jewish community of Western and Central Europe at that time. They built majestic, imposing synagogues, 4 major Ashkenazi synagogues in close proximity to each other. These were operational until their confiscation and subsequent destruction by the Nazis in the Second World War. Since 1987, they have served together, all reconstructed, as Amsterdam's Jewish Museum. Close by, the Sephardic Jews built the Portuguese Synagogue of Amsterdam, which is still upright and operational until today. With a capacity of 1,600 people, it was even the largest synagogue of the world then. Despite of the religious freedom the Dutch Jews relished, as a whole community, they had the status of strangers, foreigners, and were not treated equally as their fellow countrymen. They paid outrageously high taxes, had access only to Jewish education, healthcare, and other social institutions. They were significantly limited in career opportunities as they were excluded from most guilds, professional corporations. The leaders of the Jewish community were the Parnasim, elected from and by a selection of wealthy community members. To be entitled to this position, a Parnas, Jewish community leader, would personally have to cover the essential daily life expenses of 20 poor Jews. The Parnasim relished both spiritual and political power over the Jewish people. The vast majority of the Jewish population was desperately poor. Multiple sources describe the desolate poverty in Amsterdam's Jewish quarter. There were people in the streets wearing nothing more than rags. Others were almost naked even. According to contemporary statistics, 2/3 of the beggars in the city were Jews. Jewish men had 2, sometimes 3 jobs to support their numerous families. Street vendors would sell old clothes, worn shoes, and anything else available. Diseases were rampant. Infant mortality was common. More than 60% of Dutch Jews depended, in part or totally, on Jewish charities called tzedakah. They were supported by the Jewish community. The leaders of the Jewish community were reluctant to allow the Jewish masses to be exposed to those modern ideals. They were not interested at all to change the status quo. Now that the Dutch Jews had obtained equal rights, they would soon enough become active in various professional occupations from which previously they had been excluded. Throughout time, a Jewish middle class would emerge that no longer would depend on Jewish charities provided by the community. Consequently, the Jewish community's authority would significantly weaken. Besides, the involvement of Jews in the non-Jewish society would eventually induce them to assimilate. The tensions between these enlightened modern Jews and the Parnasim, the Jewish community leaders, grew steadily. Mr. Asser and 20 other more modern Jews had to pay a fine of 1,000 guilders each for disobedience. Their names were put on a wall of shame by the Ashkenazi synagogues. It was forbidden to marry these modern Jews or to allow one's children to play with their children. Bakers were persuaded not to bake any bread for them. Eventually, they were banished from the Ashkenazi Orthodox synagogue and founded their separate community, which they called in Yiddish Naye Kille, meaning the new community. The Hebrew name they gave themselves was Adat Yeshurun, which means the community of Israel. Their new synagogue was just around the corner from the old Ashkenazi and Portuguese synagogues. Their rabbi reached the synagogue for the first service in 1797 under armed escort. This new community would eventually grow to no more than 500 members out of all 21,500 Amsterdam Jews. These enlightened modern Jews clearly distinguished themselves from the poor Jewish masses. Mr. Asser's condition was indicative of their general well-being and their involvement in the larger non-Jewish society. He was a trader, first in coffee, then in cacao. The involvement in overseas trade exposed Mr. Asser to the Jews settled in the Dutch colonial Caribbean region. The Jewish cacao, sugar, tea, and coffee plantation owners and traders there belonged to the respected wealthy upper class and relished unprecedented legal freedom. The contrast between their socio-economic position and that of the Jewish masses in Amsterdam was undeniable. As his wealth grew throughout the years of his life, so did his standard of living. At the end of his days, Mr. Asser would be the proud owner of one of Amsterdam's largest and fanciest houses, right opposite the Mint Tower. That house had been designed some 1.5 centuries earlier by the very famous architect Vingboms for the mayor of Amsterdam, Mr. Huidekoper. Mr. Asser attended lectures and concerts. He visited cultural societies and theaters. In 1784, a Jewish opera and theater company were founded by Jacob Dessauer. The repertoire consisted of Italian, French, German and Austrian operas, which were popular at that time. Mozart's Zauberflöte and Don Giovanni were translated into Yiddish, and so were more theatrical plays, literary pieces, and newspapers. These were the fruit of the cultural symbiosis that Mr. Asser and his peers bled for. Mr. Asser and his fellow members of the new Jewish community were inspired by ideas from Paris, the capital of the Enlightenment, the center of modernity. Moreover, members of the Asser family had married women of enlightened Jewish circles from Berlin. These women imparted to the modern Dutch Jews the legacy of the German Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. He was the father of the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah. He aimed at the integration of Jews in European society. He wanted this to be achieved through the modernization of Jewish religion and Jewish education, and through the familiarization of Jews with local languages. According to Moses Mendelssohn, Jews had to conform themselves to the non-Jewish European culture. In the meantime, the revolution in France had produced disorder and chaos. Countless numbers of people had fallen victims to violent clashes between rivaling groups of opposed interests. In this turmoil, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. Napoleon was born in Corsica, an island off the French coast, part of the country's territory. He was born into a poor family, albeit of remote noble ancestry. With his scholarship, Napoleon attended the French military academy. With his mediocre physical appearance, and as the only student of humble descent, Napoleon was ostracized by his aristocratic fellow students. Later in the French army, Napoleon was promoted to the highest ranks after he conducted a series of successful military campaigns. Napoleon Bonaparte was the emblematic self-made man whose rise to power was entirely founded on his own merits. As such, Napoleon had become the embodiment of the French Revolution. Then, barely 30 years of age, Napoleon engineered a coup d'etat in 1799 and became the first consul. On December 2, 1804, Napoleon was crowned Emperor of France in the Notre Dame of Paris. Napoleon now relished control over large parts of Western Europe. For an entire decade, he would be the mightiest man of Europe. Many scholars conceive of Napoleon as the wicked absolute ruler, notorious for his cruelty, responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands. On the contrary, others view him as the enlightened emperor who acted in accordance with the will of the people and ushered in the age of modernity. Napoleon aspired to increase French control in Holland. Therefore, in 1806, he converted the Batavian Republic, until then a mere client state of France, into the Kingdom of Holland, headed by his brother Louis Bonaparte. Louis Bonaparte was forced by illness to postpone his official entry into Amsterdam until 2nd April 1808. King Louis Bonaparte settled in Amsterdam's town hall at Dam Square, which he converted into his royal palace. Emperor Napoleon commanded to be informed in detail about the condition of the Jews in his realm. He learned that their integration had stagnated. Their socio-economic position had not improved ever since they had obtained equal rights. De facto, most Jews were still excluded from many professional fields. Many non-Jews, for fear of competition, obstructed the blending of the Jews in the labor market. Others had theological objections to the Jewish integration. They doubted the Jews' civil loyalty as they awaited the Messiah to be sent by God and to gather all Jews in the land of Israel. There was profuse resistance to integration among the Jews themselves as well. The many poor among them were, partially or totally, supported financially by the Jewish community. They were afraid that Jewish integration would dilute the Jewish community and that it would weaken its support system. Furthermore, there was the language barrier. Jews from the lower classes had in general a poor command of the non-Jewish languages, and therefore they had great difficulty blending in the larger non-Jewish society. Napoleon was determined to pull off the integration of the Jews in his realm. The homogenization of unlike religious groups was vital to obtain unity in society. Unity was a precondition for his new society, governed by the will of the common people, to last. Besides, the overthrow of the king, who, crowned by the Pope, had ruled by divine right, marked the separation between church and state and the secularization of society. Religion had lost its political significance, and the distinction between diverse religious groups had become irrelevant. Napoleon aspired to turn the Jews into useful citizens. Career opportunities had to be unlocked to them, so the emperor could capitalize on their increased wealth. The Jewish identity had to be overridden by a sense of national morality, so the emperor could recruit Jewish boys to his army. In 1806, Napoleon gathered 71 rabbis and notable Jewish laymen from all over his realm. Delegates from Amsterdam's Jewish communities participated as well. Among them was Mr. Asser's son Karel. Their assembly was called Grand Sanhedrin. The name referred to the Jews' supreme judicial and legislative body in ancient history. The Grand Sanhedrin's representatives were required to answer 12 questions, which in summary demanded them, on behalf of all the Jews in Napoleon's empire, to subordinate Jewish law to French law. Napoleon aimed to denationalize Judaism, to deprive it from its national character, and to reduce it to a mere religion. The political power over the Jewish masses had to shift from the hands of the Jewish leaders to the state's authorities. The Jewish leaders would be appointed by the state. Moreover, central consistories would henceforth coordinate all Jewish matters. A civil registration, an obvious product of Napoleon's advanced and rational administration, required all Jews to be recorded by a fixed surname. They were now retraceable individually and treated as individual citizens, no longer as a whole community and a separate social category. The Jewish religion needed to be modernized and adapted to the contemporary lifestyle. The observance of the Sabbath and the kosher dietary rules impeded the Jews to be involved in the larger non-Jewish society. The strict compliance with Jewish law needed to be lessened. The translation of the sacred Hebrew text would help the Jews to improve their command of Dutch. Dutch would equally be introduced in Jewish schools. No longer would only the Jewish religion be imparted in the Jewish curriculum, but also profane subjects like history, geography, mathematics, and so. After the 1812 failed incursion into Russia, Napoleon's heyday was over. Soon thereafter, Holland released itself from French control. In 1813, the constitutional monarchy of the Netherlands, headed by the Orange family, was established. 1815 was the year of Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo. The laborious process of integration would protract after Napoleon's era well into the 20th century. The attendance of Jewish religious service and Jewish education would progressively decrease. The socio-economic position of Dutch Jews would ameliorate. The Holocaust, to which 80% of Dutch Jews would fall victim, was a catastrophic interruption of this historic process.